Okay. All right. Mrs. Wu, welcome. Hello. All the way from Taiwan. I think I heard it's like 10:30 there. 10, is
It
that
is
right?
10:30 p.m.
Rock and roll.
in
All right. Well,
Taipei.
Taipei. All right. So you've got a long and beautiful, wonderful story that has put you at the head of Ghost Island Media, which is a very interesting Taiwanese shop putting out all kinds of incredible stuff. I did some listening on some of your pods, and I have to give you a lot of props on the stuff that you guys are covering, and the work that you did with Freddie, but all the stuff that you guys are putting out, I think is super fascinating, and I can tell that you're in it for a purpose. Every single time I'm listening, I know that there's something behind it. So I'm fascinated by it, and really looking forward to digging in with you. But maybe tell me about how Emily found herself, even getting close to the pod world. I've heard the story from a few different angles, but I'm curious, where you think that path kind of started for you, way back in early days. What do you see as something that really moved you in the direction of going towards Ghost Island?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for that introduction, and really nice to meet you. So before I get into that, so we've been around for just 3.5 years. Podcasting in Taiwan is quite new. When we started
Been around
out,
about 3.5 years.
3.5 years, yeah.
Yeah.
But what we didn't realize was, we knew it was going to be big at some point, right? This is late 2018. We're planning. At first, we were just one podcast, and I go, well, and then we're going to make it big. I wanted a network. I knew there was kind of an idea of what I want this to look like. But you look around at podcasting in Taiwan, there was like 30. Literally, we counted. We just went into Apple Podcast and we typed in Taiwan and to see what popped up. In Mandarin, of course, and like 30 shows popped up. They were good. They were good shows, but then you look at how I think the adaptation rate for things like Spotify was a lot quicker now than ever before. For tech, so we're like, well, this is going to happen soon at some point, right? And people are already listening to YouTube. They're like, the behavior's there. They just don't know that they're doing podcasting. So we thought, well, let's start now, and so that by the time that it's kind of the market opens up, we're already there. What we didn't know was there were quite a few people thinking the same thing as us. So the summer of 2019, I think a lot of kind of content creators all launched their shows, and an app launched, a couple of apps launched eventually, and that really helped to grow the market. So we now have 11 shows. We have podcasts in English, in Mandarin, and one in French that I was very excited about.
Didn't know that.
Yeah. That was a new show from this year. And that's actually a multilingual show. It was the first time we did a multilingual, and I don't mean like bilingual where you mix language within one episode. Is where we're doing, every episode has 2 language versions, and we release them simultaneously. So I really, really like that exercise, and I want to do more with that in the future. And so, yeah, with the mission, so our shows, we do current affairs, we have environment, we have cannabis, we have politics, Taiwan history, Taiwan current affairs, documentary looking at cancer, it's happy ending, it's happy story, mentorship, kind of for young creators, and gender. And yeah, so we kind of, our shows are not, we're not the biggest in Taiwan, by far, we're not. There's other shows that are with much larger audience, that tend to be a lot of comedy. Comedy is really popular here as well. But I think what we want to do is that, like, there's a couple of us, we there are topics that we want to see more conversations about. So we're like, okay, well, we happen to know an expert in this space, so let's put them in front of the mic and let's get that conversation going. So eventually we start building out the same model. So that's kind of who we are, Ghost Island Media, based in Taiwan. The team's very small. We have about just 5 people, and it grows and shrinks at different times. I think right now it's like 4, 5. Yeah, and so, but how did I get into it? I come from content. I've always done kind of TV, broadcasting, documentary, and journalism. And so factual programming was what I always did. But it was always in video, and it's expensive and very, very expensive when it was in TV. But then the internet age came, and we're trying to make viral videos. Still, it was factual programming. I don't know if your listeners remember, but back in like 2010, there was this thing called the Taiwanese animation, where we would take global stories and just make a satire out of it. And it was politics, it was sports, it was U.S. elections, it was, Berlin Bears, it was anything. And it was very, very funny. And we were trying to figure out, how do you go viral on the internet? Anyways, and then eventually I did corporate film production. Still, video was very expensive. So, and then at some point I went solo, and I wanted to, there came a time where I wanted to really talk about these topics that were really important to me and the people around us. But, video was so expensive, and audio was a much more accessible and more affordable way of starting. So we thought, you know what, let's do this. Because also at the time I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and I really loved it. Like, I loved that. Like, I was just listening to niche podcasts and also popular ones anywhere in the world. I love that. So I don't know. How did you get into podcasting?
That's a great question. I think, I was certainly drawn in by a few of them. Sam Harris was great. And there are a lot of them that I would listen to just all the time. I was a big driver, like in college, driving for like Favor or, Uber, whatever it was, just trying to survive. And I loved it. And I picked up one called Masters in Business with Barry Ritholtz. And it, I was lucky enough to go to like a really solid school, but that podcast taught me so much more about business that I started thinking to myself, like, if this medium can teach you that much about a topic that you've paid an enormous amount of money to actually go to school about, then it's fairly limitless. But there's actually really good, interesting science about it too. So, like, one of the reasons that you have such close connections with the hosts and their guests, you feel like you know them. Like, if I met Joe Rogan on the street, I'd be like, I know you, buddy. I know your brain front and back, right? Is they say partly because there's no visual cues to like knock your brain out of the fact that person's not actually there. So there's it because it's such like a direct connection. It has a lot of application, right? And like the bandwidth has increased enormously, and so there's a lot of like maybe crap out there, but there's also an ability to put things out there that don't get the blessing of somebody at Disney or whatever it is, and I think that bandwidth increase, one, it allows you to talk about really hot topics like yours in Taiwan, and number two, it allows you to have really authentic conversations because nobody is in charge, and so I thought that was a really interesting kind of social aspect to the business. But then if you just look at the macro trends on it, I mean, it's ridiculous. The growth of listenership and ad spend and things like that is enormous. And also companies, because people, as a result of the pandemic in America, work from home is a huge thing. And companies are trying to, connect with their workforces. And internally, we saw an opportunity there as kind of like internal comms that are actually produced and done well. So being able to connect the dots there. There was I'll tell you a story. I know this is your show, but I'll tell you a story about one of the guys that we interviewed, so InVenture is the venture studio. We help stand up these businesses. Audily is one of them. And when we were building it, one of the things we always do is build a really strong advisory board. So I was doing one of the interviews for these board members. I was this old, British guy, he was like bald and like he looked like what an evil person would look like. Right? It's like, very disturbing views about humanity, et cetera. But he was an actually legit media executive, and so not naming any names, but so we were having this conversation. He was telling me about how he escaped the salt mine, basically, like how he kind of reached escape velocity, and it was because he found that the porn channels, the pay-per-view porn channels, very cheap during the day, relative to other TV channels. And so he went to companies that have a lot of field agents, like insurance agents or things like that, where there's a headquarters, but then a lot of people in the field that need training and things like that. And so they were always bringing these people into the headquarters to do their training. And he said, hey, look, instead of taking all of that spend, I'm just going to put a small little production studio. We're going to record the training, and then we're going to shoot it out over corporate TV. And he didn't tell them it was porn channels, but that's how he kind of got started. And there's a huge corollary there, but to the next level for comms for businesses, as companies that were localized now are much more dispersed. So that was an interesting one, but ultimately we found ourselves working a lot more with creatives and audiobooks and things like that anyway. But that was one of the initial kind of slugs of business that we looked into. But I always thought
I think there's a lot of space in that. I mean, when we definitely, I could only imagine, back in 2010 or 2014, what that must have been like in the States, because we got a little bit of taste of that over in Taiwan. So what I mean by this is, like, when we started we launched, our first show was actually in English, it's on the environment, but our first show in Mandarin was on cannabis, and it was a huge huge risk to take, because mid 2019 cannabis was, it's still a taboo here, but it was more so back then. Back then, like, TVs didn't talk about it, news didn't talk about it, magazine. There was an underground scene, but nobody dared talk about it in the mainstream media. And we kind of found a way to kind of wiggle through that. And what happened was we met this woman. She was a kind of up-and-coming politician to be, activist also. She's a lawyer. And she eventually became still the only cannabis-only lawyer in Taiwan. So we met her, and she wanted to talk about this, and we thought, wait, this is great.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yes. Yeah. Legalization, medical, industry, there's a lot of potentials. I mean, even if a country doesn't legalize it for recreational or adult use, there's still a lot of applications for industrial use. So we thought, actually, we need to get Taiwan to talk about this, and nobody dared touch it. And so it was very risky for us to carry that show. But to the point where a year later, we won Best Host in Taiwan, Best Show Host in Taiwan with that show.
Wow.
And yeah, it was awesome. But I tell you what, even the evening news TV that talked about that award ceremony, they didn't mention us.
Wow.
They didn't mention the show. It was that bad, right? And so I think for indie media, there's a way for us to kind of wiggle through. We have less baggage than traditional kind of legacy news media. So that's been really, really interesting. So that show is going strong, and then since then we've done more bigger, kind of like less niche topic now. But the cannabis movement is still, it's growing. It's still smallish compared to places where they've legalized. But yeah, that was something really cool. And so I can only imagine, that gave me a window of wow, I can't imagine, in 2014 when podcasting kind of blew up in the States, what that must have been like for a lot of the creators and indie creators and companies. Man, yeah. So we're just really happy to kind of be a part of that.
Yeah, David did a very similar thing here in the States, who you saw earlier, Cannabinoids was his podcast, and talked a lot about it, and being able to pierce through some of the woo woo in it is so needed, because it's easy for folks to, I think, just kind of put it in a box. But there's so much interesting stuff that's going on. I saw something this morning, actually. I just asked Jillian to reach out to this guy. Now it's becoming more and more accessible. There's someone going on, Bram Rector, set up a new VC fund that's investing all in early stage psychedelics. So it's just crazy to see the progress that's happened. So Bram, please join the podcast. I'd love to talk to you about it. But it's crazy interesting to see, going from, World War II, United States, where any of this stuff was just completely out of the ordinary. you know, and seeing how kind of rapid the progress can be, I think is a little bit bewildering, but there's so much toil that goes into every single one of those pieces. It's really interesting. And I don't know if you know, one of there's just so there's so much overlap between us. One of our other one of the other businesses that we help stand up, Merchant Boxes. So they help do all the design and packaging for goods, right? You know, things that are coming and going. And their first niche that they put their foot into was cannabis, because there's all these new brands. Everybody needs different designs, you know, and like so the big players wouldn't jack with them. And so you know, on our Discord server, you know, every week or two, you know, you get like, hey, we designed like this cool, you know, cannabis. I'm like, it's a great place to work, you know. It's like, this is really cool, you know. And then you see them get ordered, and you know, they get to work with all these great people. I mean, it's amazing. But being able to get to that place requires folks like you to take the punches and do the hard work before it's even possible to get there.
Yeah, there's a lot happening in this space, and I think we obviously we just, you know, that little part of it with media, but I think it does help with public awareness. And you know, actually, after we launched the show, I was actually really surprised. I have everybody I've heard from across age and demographics in Taiwan. Everybody's like, "Oh yeah, that's great. Finally, somebody's talking about it." And it turned out like nobody's really against it, but somehow the law is still very, very strict. But with podcasting, we've been able to kind of experiment with format as well. So like earlier, I talked a little bit about multilingual, so that was really fun. But last year we also worked on a documentary, and it spanned 1 year. And so we'd never done anything like that before, where it was one project and it was just, you know, the tape was from the entire year of story, and now we need to put it together in a cohesive way. And we launched it. We made visuals for the first episode, and we launched it in the cinema. It was all very, very experimental. It was black screen basically the entire time. We just forced people to sit in there and like watch minimal visuals.
Hey, but it's art. It's art.
Yeah. The point we're trying to make is that like podcasting isn't just radio. It actually is the beginning of some sort of an IP, right? This show, your show, it could be a TV show, it could be a book, it could be a game, it could be a board game next year. Like it's not just podcasting. So we really kind of that was the message we were trying to send, and to get film industry and like also advertising people excited about this medium. Feel like there's a lot of potential for this. So that's been really fun too, kind of experimenting with the medium and see what else we could do with it, and a lot else. Like we haven't done an interactive. I think that would be really interesting to do.
So tell me a little bit about the early days of Ghost Island, when you guys were first getting started, standing that up. You know, I'm assuming it started with, you know, the first show, and you know, getting it produced, finding, you know, the sponsors or advertisers, getting it staffed up. Tell me a little bit about that, but then I'm really curious about how you transitioned from being a show to being a network. That I'm super interested. But tell me about the first show first. Yeah.
Okay. So the first show, I knew that I wanted to do podcasting, and I was looking for a host. I didn't need to be the host. I just wanted to produce. And somebody said, "Oh, you know, meet this guy. He's looking for a producer." Well, that sounds like a good match. I didn't know what he did yet, but it turned out he did environment, and that was something that I had a bit of experience with in my previous jobs. So I was like, okay, I can take this on. Like, so. But it was so early in Taiwan that nobody had recording studios. Like, nowadays, there's a lot of podcasting studios. But back then, you either have one-person voiceover recording rooms, you know, in radio stations or TV stations, or you have this massive space that's for music recording. Right. And there's nothing in between. So, So we ended up, I just, you know, I borrowed a mic from my ex at the time, who was at a news studio, and his production people had given him a USB mic. It was top of the line. And so I borrowed that, and we were in my brother's, like, study. I was staying with my brother at the time. But it turned out like it was a perfect space because the study was, even though it was a very small room, it was just surrounded by books. So it was the perfect like sound room. Yeah. And so our mic stands were actually just like books stacked up. And there was a dog involved, this German Shepherd who lived with us at the time, who turned out to be the perfect first audience. Because at the time, like, me coming from video, I kind of had an idea that, you can't keep talking for so long, there's a rhythm, and you have to take breaks. And a lot of it was through experimentation to figure out what that should be, what that tempo should be, what that pacing should be. How do you convert a video sequence? How do you reimagine a video sequence into an audio sequence? So all that just kind of trial and error. And after a while, if Nate, the host of that environment show, Waste Not, Why Not, if Nate spoke for too long without pausing, the German Shepherd would just let out this. She wasn't happy. At first we laughed it off, and then we're like, wait a second, I think there's something in that. And then it turned out, and then we would test the same sequence or test the same scenario on people, on friends who would be very honest with us. And they actually gave the exact same feedback. It was like, okay, this is where I dozed off. This is where,
where the eyes glazed over. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was really interesting. So our first audience was a dog. Very a sweetheart, very honest listener. From there on, we ended up, we launched the show, and we would tell people that we're in a study, and they were like, oh, no, come, like, we have space here, right? Like, I've got an office, can you come and take a look? And people were so kind. I think what I realized about startups is that when you're, first starting up, if you tell people what you're trying to do, and if you show them that you are working really hard at making it happen, they help you. They may not be funding you just yet, but they're helping you with what they can. They say, oh, what do you need to know? Like, do you need to know microphone people? Let me introduce you to microphone people. Do you need space? Maybe I don't have space, but I think somebody else has space. Or here, talk to this co-working space. They have a lot of empty rooms right now. And so that's what we did. I rented a desk at one of the co-working spaces, and they let us use one of their rooms for free for a while, until we kind of outgrew that. Or what did they say? Yeah, they were just so kind in helping us. And I think being at that stage in the startup scene, it is so hard because a lot of people are telling you can't do this, or why are you doing this, or like, okay, how long are you going to be doing this, right? They're counting, they're clocking you, but and others are just like, all right, go, right? Like, they see you're working your butt off, and they see you're producing something, and everybody's so supportive. And so I think now whenever we meet young creators, like, we really try to give back that way. Because otherwise, I don't know, personal passion, that runs out really quickly. Like, if you don't have a community behind you.
Yeah, I would agree. I think if it was just me showing up to work every day without all these wonderful people, I think it would disappear almost overnight. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So tell me about.
So it's really cool. Yeah, so it's really cool. Like, I think when this opportunity came up, I think it's really cool what you're doing with the early stage startup, because you, as an early stage, you need that environment, right? You need that camaraderie from other studios that are going through the same things. They may not be in the same space, but they're going through the same things, and you're like, oh. And other people have gone through and say, it's okay, right? And like, yeah, like, all that matters. That community camaraderie matters so much. So it's cool for people like you and studios like you that like help us through. It's great.
Yeah, I think it's. I don't know. It's really interesting. Not only, do they get all the, functional, like what we actually do is one thing, right? Like, helping them with all the legal stuff and, the business modeling and all the functional people. But I think a huge part of the value is just not just the end staff, but the other presidents and staff, senior staff that are working on a similar but different, business, and they can really, cross pollinate with each other, all kinds of different stuff. And you got someone that's going through the exact same thing as you. I think is, there's just like a hell of a lot of comfort in that, and we all kind of come up a little bit stronger. So I don't know. It's a decent way to do it, but certainly not possible without the pandemic, because this this is the office. There's no no physical space. Like every once in a while we'll have to get together, like rent a big Airbnb or something, but like it's pretty rare. We're all just kind of wherever we are, and I'm assuming that you guys need pretty significant studio space, because you've got a pretty permanent team, it sounds like. What was that like? So as part of the transition from the one show to kind of growing into a network, what was the staffing like? Like how did that go about? Dealing with advertisers, setting up a new show, tell me a little bit about that transition to a network.
The funny thing is, I think back now, it's 3.5 years, and a lot of it is such a blur. I remember, I say this because, in the early days when it's just one person, two persons, and then you're getting emails in from people who say, hey, I see what you're doing, and I think it's kind of cool. I got some time, can I volunteer? And everybody knows that as media at that early, you don't have funding. And so we relied so much on volunteers, and then incredible interns. And then all of a sudden, we were like releasing a documentary at like a movie theater. It was wild. Like thinking back, I think is that at every stage we just kept saying, okay, now we need this. All right, now that a new volunteers come in and they've done so much incredible work, and then we transfer them over to full-time, and now all of a sudden we have 3 shows. And then okay, we've got more people coming in. We found another host who would do a really interesting show. Now we got 4. Okay, now that we got 4, but then there's topics I want to talk about. Let's go out and find a journalist who would host that. Now we've got 5. We just kind of slowly kept building it. I don't have a really good answer for that, except that it was kind of the literally nature of it. One step at a time.
Right.
Yeah, kind of. But I think what really helped was that my co-founder and I, Kathy, she had been my coworker like about 10 years ago. So we knew each other very, very well. We complement each other really well. And I think we really see eye to eye on what it was we wanted to do and a type of show we wanted to do. And our pocket list of topics we wanted to work on or formats we wanted to try, it was always there. Like I still have this full pocket list. And so I think when things fall into place, they happen quickly. When we have a meeting with somebody that said, oh, I'd like to try, whatever kind of, this topic or that space, we're like, already we come up with a pitch really quickly because it wasn't something we came up on the spot. It's something we've been thinking about for a whole year already. They just nobody knew because it was a conversation Kathy and I already had at some late night about like dreaming about the shows we wanted to do. So I think it was just that like, because we had it on our head. So when we're in front of somebody who was ready to take that pitch, we just kind of did it really quickly. But so that was kind of the scale up, but I think staying at that fast pace was very challenging because where you need enough manpower to sustain that. And that turned out to be, that's quite a challenge.
Oh, yeah. And we're kind of, that's the whole game.
Yeah.
So I can relate to that so much, as a studio, we're always putting together new stuff. So it's so similarly related because, when we set out with our first kind of set of businesses, right, it wasn't kind of all at once. We kind of built them together over time, but they were kind of close together into what we've now called cohort 1, right? And so when we first started, we like to call it like the list of like Sam's bad ideas, that kind of like first, and then we started tearing them apart. Yeah. But then we started talking to more and more people and talking to like what's now like the nth board, like how did you guys come up with this stuff so quick? I was like, Man, I've been thinking about this since I was like 12 years old. Like, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I've been waiting my whole life to, put some of these things together. And it's so amazing to have, when things kind of align, you're like, oh, this is the perfect moment for this. So I think I can certainly relate to that.
Yeah. There are days when things just kind of fall, when things fall into place like that. There are days like I'm at work and I just look around. I'm like, I'm so in love with everybody here, my coworkers. I love you guys for the work you do. Because it is right. These are things you've wanted to do for decades. You just didn't know how you're going to realize it. But at this moment in 2022, this was how we're realizing this. And when it all comes together, you're like, I'm so thankful.
So talk to me about when the love in the room disappears. Tell me about some of those hard times. Managing people is an art in and of itself and a skill. And especially at a new place. You can rely, like you said, on some of the the personal passion for a while, but there's all kinds of different styles, and I'm always infinitely curious about how people, when they first start managing serious teams, what that experience was like, things that surprised them, things that they learned to help make it a little bit more manageable.
Yeah. I think we've worked with a lot of people in the past 3.5 years, and some are because they're volunteers, so they would volunteer their time whenever they could. Others are interns, other full-times that did anything from 2 years to actually like 4 months. And I think being in the small team, it is tough if you don't have a good retention rate. But being in the small team, I think you have to wear so many hats, and not everybody is prepared to do that at that point in their life. And I think what we learned too late was that I didn't how do you prepare somebody for that? And early on, we had a lot of younger employees coming in, and they're so smart, they're so capable, and I forget they're so young. And you find out later that they're really stressed. They felt stressed because they thought they were taking on too much. But I was like, but you're so smart, you're so capable. You don't, and then they burn out easily. So that's something we had to learn in a hard way. So our solution to that is just have more one-on-ones and check in with them a lot more. How are you doing? How are you feeling about this? How are you learning? How do you feel like the feedback has been? But even that process is different with everyone. I remember the first time I learned how to be a manager when I was, I think it was 27, and it was like a 6-month learning process for me. It was tough. I didn't realize it was so tough, but later on people were like, oh man, that was tough. Yeah. Learned so much about, and at that time when I was learning to be a manager, and down to the things of because everybody's different. So do you treat everybody differently? Do you, some people, they like it direct. Other people, you need to do DM with them because that's how they process things. Yet other people, you need to give them space. Other people, they don't care for that. And they just say, you just if you give them space, they actually think it's an insult because why do you think I need space? So it's a lot of learning like that. And I think I'm still learning probably. And I think it's probably a lifelong process. And this is why we're practicing this every day with our partners in life, with our families, right? So that I do see that the older I get, the easier probably it gets.
Relatively.
Right? I think. Relatively, yeah. But also, I don't take things as personally anymore. I think that comes with age and experience a little bit. I don't know if that's good or bad, but I don't know. I think that also my co-founder and I, we're really good about discussing without fighting. And I don't know that everybody can do that. And I had to learn, I learned later that not everybody could do that.
Yeah, that's a very key skill, I think. If you're going to be in a job where it's about ideas and decisions and strategy, you absolutely have to be able to disagree effectively and all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But
and then move on quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a couple of things that you said that I think are really interesting, because we found the same problem, you know, early on. You know, we had a sense for how important it was for people to be kind of, we call it entrepreneurial, which I think you're saying is like being able to wear a lot of hats, right? And just do whatever, roll up your sleeves, do whatever you got to do. Because a lot of those folks, you know, we shoot for people that have an enormous amount of experience to lead these things, because they need to understand the industry better than us. But there's certainly a risk of bringing on folks that are kind of like institutionalized, or, you know, they had things brought to them, or, you know, been kind of in this soft environment for so long where, you know, kind of issuing commands from the ivory tower, you get used to it, right? And so being able to test effectively for, does this person actually want to roll up their sleeves and do a lot of hard work with their fingers or whatever it is, we found is probably more important than we thought at the early days. And I think relate to that because, you know, the younger folks that you bring on, so much energy and they're so smart, and you just need a little bit of, you know, point and shoot and like, hey, you know, go tackle this thing. And another thing I picked up when you said the one-on-ones, I found that to be amazingly helpful. You know, every other Friday, my whole Friday is just one-on-ones with as many people as I can fit in, because I think you're right, it helps. Wow. It helps so much. Yeah. But it's an investment, you know, like if that's a lot of time. But you know, if you're in the kind of business that we are, it's a necessary one, I think. Especially if you don't have that direct connection. So I can relate to everything you're saying.
Yeah, I didn't realize that until when we realized the need for one-on-ones. We didn't always do them until we realized we needed to. And I'm asking around to other founders, like, how often do you do your one-on-ones? And, you know, the response I get was like basically half of their job was one-on-ones. Right. Because they have their direct and then their skips. And I'm like, wait, half of your time is doing our one-on-ones? And they're like, well, you're managing, right? I'm like, oh my gosh. I think it makes sense. I just didn't realize it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's huge.
Because where I came from, the companies I was at in Taiwan at the time, we didn't do one-on-ones. I think you had regular check-ins, but it wasn't this rigid one-on-one, you know, and then the skips. And so in the back of my mind, I knew that the value of it, but I didn't know that there was a way you could structure your company this way, and that you know, and so on. And then as soon as we started doing it, I was like, oh, I get it. Okay, we should have always done this.
Yeah. I'd have one of the people here, Sam. He does, you know, he does ones where he's like, okay, I'm going to do my directs every 2 weeks. Then as part of that, I'm also going to do like a rotating skip. So he's able to kind of keep a general connection with like that next layer, but not have to do every single one all the time. I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't know. I haven't done that one, but apparently that works pretty well too.
Yeah. So the company that I'm referring to, they're about 60 to 70 people, 10 years old, software company, and their directs were it's weekly, and their skips are every 2 weeks.
Oh my gosh, that's just insane. I mean, that's
like, their employees. Yeah.
Look, sometimes we gotta do it.
Yeah, but apparently it works. It's a great place to work. The people are happy. They do really good work. And so I was like, okay, cool. That's what I had to learn from. And that's the thing, is that I think being in the startup space, there are, you know, around us are startups in all different stages. And so we can look at them and say, how are you dealing with COVID? How are you dealing with remote? We had a really hard time with remote working. You know, how are you dealing with the one-on-ones? What do you do with your one-on-ones? What do you do for your company retreat, whatever? Like, you can kind of swap these stories, and they're all very kind about, because you're right, they're 5-10 years old. They're very, very kind about, you know, telling us what worked for them and not. And then, you know, we have a lot to reference.
Yeah. We almost.
But yeah.
We almost went into like a Pokemon style game. This startup. Shout out to Cosmos. Thank you guys for the demo. But so it was like you basically go into like this virtual office. It was actually pretty cool. Like it was well integrated with like Google and everything. You know, you could go in there and just be like sitting in this fake office. You know, and it was like
kind of like wait, there's another one that got really popular. It not Pokemon, but it like 8-bit. Space? Hangout? What is it called?
It maybe, I'm not sure. But I know that there's a couple of them out there now where it's all like low res and like, but apparently people love it. So we looked at stuff like that. See, we didn't want to implement it because, you know, the studio staff is kind of like a smaller team where all the businesses, they all had their own needs. So we didn't want to like, you know, as the empire demand that everybody use this crazy stuff. So we ultimately didn't do it, but you know, there's all kinds of crazy stuff to do, and there's all kinds of options. You know, I tell people that there's absolutely no way we couldn't have started unless the pandemic happened. So you know, there is some kind of silver lining to people being able to take back a lot of authority of the way that they do their work, because you know, expectations have totally changed, and so I think that is one of the great things about the transition.
So our pandemic for Taiwan didn't really hit until last year, about 12 months ago. So we're a bit different, is that we got an early start in COVID control, kind of as soon as it started breaking out in China, and in like late December, early January 2020, we closed our borders to China, and it saved us. However, what it meant was that for the whole year of 2020, that it was quite rough for the world. It was very easy in Taiwan. Very few cases. Our lives didn't change that much. We still went to work. We still went to school. We still went to. I think we were the only country in the world at the time that was still going to school. Our baseball games were still playing. Our concerts were still playing. That was definitely the only
still concerts.
place in the world. It was very, very special. So a lot of Taiwanese Americans actually came back to Taiwan during that year to live, because it was free. It was as if there was no COVID. It was almost COVID free. But it meant that we were late on our vaccine because there wasn't really a need at the time. So last year in May 2021, finally we had our first wave, and that was before vaccines started. And so we were entirely a year late. So my friends in the States were joking. They would joke like, welcome to the world. Now you've caught up to the world, right? So we didn't start remote working until a year ago. And it was quite hard for our staff because in Taiwan, our apartments are very small. Not everybody's apartments have good studies. Not every apartment has even desks. And so people actually didn't love working from home. They actually prefer coming to the office where there was space. There was AC. Summers were really hot here. And there was like really, really good internet. And so camaraderie and team morale was like at an all-time low for us. And so we had to figure out like, what do you do? Like, how do you schedule? Like, do you send, I don't know, what do you do? You know, do you do parties online? Do you try to have lunches together still, but in front of the computer? It was very, very tricky. So when we got back to the office, people were very happy.
That's very interesting. That's a totally different experience. I tried doing stupid stuff. Like I would hold like a morning coffee. I would just like invite everybody from the studio, and like one or two people would show up, and you know, it would be like hey Sam, what's up? And eventually everybody just stopped coming. I was like, okay, I guess nobody wants to do extra work in the morning. But it's tough. You know, you want to. You know, you want to develop and make sure that people have like open and safe places, but without, you know, demanding that they do extra crap or like mandatory fun, you know, nobody enjoys.
Right. Yeah. Well, when you're at a big company that you say, okay, well, there's coffee hours in the morning, you might have like 10% of people who show up, and that's 10 people. That's fine, right? But if you're a company of 6, right? Like, if you say there is a social, it just sounds mandatory.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. When I was in DC working for like a pickle company on the weekends when I was an intern, after like the weekends were like the big thing, and all the staff, what they did was amazing. They would have you bring like family, significant others, and everybody would just have like a big picnic like once a month or something like that. And it wasn't a big team, but you'd work your butt off, and then finally getting able to just kind of relax with everybody and bring your folks in and have like some really good food was great. But not everybody is like works in a big industrial kitchen, so it's like I think it's got to probably fit whatever that you're whatever style that you're working in.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit more about you built this for lack of a better word, freedom fighter network that I think a lot of people are very proud of. Tell me about how you see the future of both everything you're doing, Ghost Island Media. What does that look like for you? Where are you guys headed?
Yeah. So you say freedom fighter. I would give a bit more context to listeners on what I think what that means to me. When I started this in 2018, the visibility of Taiwan as a country in the world was very low. And this has to do with the rise of China. This has to do with also mostly the rise of China. I think China was a very exciting time for the last decade. Economic growth, and it was opening up. And so a lot of journalists were covering China extensively. The tech sector was just so much movement. It was a very interesting, very exciting place. And at the time, Taiwan was kind of getting left out in the conversation. We're still not in the UN. We're, when we launched a show on climate, and if you look at United Nations reports on anything climate, you won't see Taiwan. Our numbers are in there somewhere. Is it under China? Is it under special regions? I have no idea. And we used to rely on just foreign journalists, international journalists writing about us. But then they stopped writing about us. I was like, and you work so hard. Yeah, you work so hard to and there's even when finally then at some point there was a Taiwanese rights worker who was kidnapped and detained illegally in China. Even then we didn't make the pages, right? I'm like, oh, come on. And that's kind of what I realized. Well, we don't have to rely on them. We can do it ourselves. And already there was a good number of people writing in English language for websites, but on the audio space there wasn't as many. There was maybe like a couple. So we thought that was something that we could do. So a lot of it at the time was to raise the visibility. So if you look at the Taiwan programming, English programming initially, it's on Taiwan current affairs. It's talking about Taiwanese politics and history. Getting our story out there, Taiwanese storytelling. That's on the English side. On the Mandarin side, it's talking about topics we wanted more conversations about. So similar concept, but like different topics. So on the Mandarin side, it's cannabis. It's women empowerment. It's cancer and kind of love and death. These topics that are not usually in your mainstream media. Now, actually we had great coverage in 2020 because we were kind of the only place that in the world that was COVID free. That got us a lot of coverage. A lot of case studies about what happened. How do we do this? And also now with Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, a lot of parallels are being drawn. And so I think for me, what it means, I think the mission is changing a little bit now. It's no longer raising the visibility of Taiwan because we are a lot more visible than we have been. I think for now, it's just strengthening this alliance around the world. This pro-democracy, this pro-values, pro-LGBT rights, kind of progressive values. And I haven't actually said this on the record yet, so this will be interesting. So now that I've said it, now I have to do it. So check back with me in 6 months and in a year and see what happens.
Hey, we'll have another one of these. It'll be perfect, Emily.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about you guys really put yourself out there. What kind of backlash have you seen? I'm sure there's been some kind of, at least risk of threats. How do you guys deal with that, or what have you seen so far at the first few years here?
When we had our first, whether it's just like general haters or political backlash, I think we celebrate it and say, oh, good, that means we're out of the echo chamber, right? Like, because if you're not getting backlash, if people are not disagreeing with you, it means you're still speaking to your own kind, and which is fine, but that means, the more there is, we don't try to steer that pot. Like, we don't say, okay, well, let's just say whatever just to get that backlash. It's just that if there's disagreeing voices coming in for the different values, then that means your show is reaching a lot of people, then that's good. Then that's you're actually making that conversation happen. So we've seen that with the China show, of course. Not so much with the cannabis. There's been a couple that was like interestingly against us. My show with Freddie Lim, that had some backlash, right? We thought, I don't know. So we said, so yeah, again, like we say it's okay, that's good. We're no longer just talking to our own friends.
I think that's a great mistake there. Metalhead Politics, what a great name for the show. I think that's fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you this, Emily. There are a lot of folks out there. I never talk this much in podcasts, but I can relate so much to what you're doing, because much like you're creating individual shows, we're creating, these businesses, and I just relate so much to the similar struggles here. If you had to boil down some of the lessons you learned, what do you know now that you wish you knew when you were first getting started, or some helpful advice for folks that are just starting out, kind of creating a path of their own?
So much. So much. But I think probably the most practical, one of the things, this didn't happen to me, this happened to a friend. And it also made me realize, I think having really good lawyers help. Have really, really good lawyers, do the papers right, and read the line between the lines. And I say this because a friend of mine here, she founded a company, and then her then boyfriend joined her as co-founder. They ran the company together for 2 years, and then they broke up. That's usually a very messy situation, because not only are you dealing with the emotional fallout, there's legal fallout of what happens. You're co-founders, you both have stakes in, you both have investments in. What do you do? Both people want to claim the company because it's doing well. There's a lot of potential. What do you do? And she was like, oh, actually, there was a clause in their agreement that in the event of a breakup, of their personal romance breakup, one person gets to buy back the shares from the other person. It was designated who that person was. And she was like, yeah, so we didn't have to deal with it because it was already written down. She was like, I had a really good lawyer. And it was in that situation, because I think a lot of these, whether it's with a staff or whether with a co-founder or your client, anybody, right? Like, emotions can get in the way a lot. And that was an example of where, I saw in what she went through that it was dealt with gracefully and they could move on healing, personal healing, because what they signed on the legal was so clear cut, and then it wasn't ugly at all. And that's extraordinary. Like, yeah. I would say probably that. Have a really, really good lawyer.
Good counsel. Never bad advice. Well, Emily, thanks a lot for joining. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Okay.
It's been really fun.
Okay. All right. So hang on for just a little